Hello, and welcome to this short stream in which the concept is not actually music creation, but just a short introduction dash tutorial regarding uh, what's like this modern music production all about in home studio. And of course, it's a real big question, and it has very much variety regarding how do people go about it. And in this video I'm going to go through my own personal setup and the software that I have sort of like just happened to end up using. And to most of these things there are like options, and some people do some things a bit different way than me, but eventually you end up in your personal preferences that are not necessarily better or worse, but just sort of like work for you and feel more intuitive for you than some other options. And mostly it's all about sort of like gathering enough experience to be able to make those decisions sort of like in an informal or informative way. And my personal background or history regarding this is that I built my first PC-based studio back in 2006, so a bit over 10 years ago. And back in the day, the music technology was still very much far from the current state, and the available sound libraries and software was quite a bit more narrow and not as good as these days. And for some reason or other, I just happened to pick up the DAW called Cubase from Steinberg, which is sort of like freemium or really crude version of the Cubase that I still use. And I don't remember the version number, but it was probably something like 3, if the current one is 10, so quite a few versions to go. And basically the Cubase back in the day looked pretty similar to the Cubase these days, so in many ways I have sort of like used Cubase for over 10 years, so it's sort of like the DAW that's most intuitive and easy for me to just like jump into. And I still haven't really spent much time like figuring out all the possible things that you can do with Cubase, so I sort of like use only really small amount of all the options that one has. So any modern professional DAW is actually full of like different things that you can do with them, and one can like read the manual through a couple of times and still not like know all the possible things that one can do. So it's a never-ending thing, and to learn all the like options that the DAW has. And once again, you end up with these preferences that how you go about creating music yourself, and what options are you finding like reasonable to use, and what's the most efficient way to go about it. So yeah, that's like the short background for me, and hence in this video I'm going to sort of like present some of the basic things from the perspective of Cubase. And if you end up using some other DAW, some of the things are sort of like similar, and some of the things can be really different. I have some experience, for example, with a DAW called Ableton Live, which is quite a bit different from Cubase, because the whole design idea revolves more around live playing and electronic music, I guess. So if one learns how to use Ableton Live well, then there is like this sort of design gap between the traditional DAWs and Ableton. So it's a bit different realm. And but anyways, yeah, Cubase is quite standard, and many other DAWs are pretty similar to Cubase, like line of thinking and going about it. And if one has like experience with music and composing, many traditional like classical composers who have studied composition and arrangement in university level, they usually learn how to like compose with pen and paper and just notation. And before even these modern DAWs were around, there has been like different notation software. For example, Sibelius is quite like common and with long history. And notation software in many ways is sort of like a bit similar to DAWs, because if one has like any notes in DAW, however they're like arranged, it is possible to in Cubase and most of the other DAWs to look at the notation. So if I have like some notes that I've recorded or just like put together, there is always possibility for me to also look at the score. So in a sense, Cubase contains lots of the things that, for example, Sibelius offers, but it approaches it from a bit different perspective, because with DAW you rarely write these notes straight away. It's more usual to play them with MIDI keyboard or such. So it's a bit more like wide realm. But if one has like experience with Sibelius and notation, then jumping into Cubase and similar modern DAW is sort of like quite straightforward, and there is not like a big gap to it. But it requires a bit more wide understanding of the music technology. So I think that in some interviews, for example, John Williams has said that he like still likes to just like use pen and paper, and he hasn't really touched any modern DAW, whereas Hans Zimmer, for example, has had like really long and intense collaboration with Steinberg and Cubase. So some of the modern composers are more like oriented toward this kind of technology, and some of them are like more towards the classical way of doing things. And hence there is the question that how big of a thing it is for anybody to sort of like wrap your head around this technology thing. And of course, for me, it's sort of like hard to say that how hard it will be for your average person, because I don't really know. But at least my intuitive experience is that it's not really that hard, because the basic concept or idea behind music production is still just that there is music, and music is notes, and there is not like too much extra going on. That's the main thing, that you want to record notes and you want to make them output sound, and that's the thing. So we're still like revolving around that basic idea all the time, and there is not much else going on. But if we start from the basic idea that what does Cubase or any modern DAW actually do, there's like two levels to it. There's the traditional audio like signal and audio wave files kind of way of thinking. And in Cubase project, you always have like this collection of different tracks or channels. And if you approach it from the traditional like band kind of concept way, then it would revolve mainly around audio tracks. And audio tracks are the tracks that actually contain digitalized wave information. So if you want to record a drum line or a guitar line, you would have to have like a microphone and then you play with your guitar and you record that audio with your microphone, and then in your DAW you have an audio track into which the actual audio signal is being recorded to as a WAV file. So you would end up with an actual WAV file that already contains the actual sound. And then if you record the whole band, then you would have like different audio tracks, and then you would mix them and end up with the actual stereo wave that mixes them all together. So this would be like the traditional way that studios have been working for the whole like music era of the past decades. But the only difference is that instead of having like physical tapes, you would have these digitalized versions of the audio information. But the way that I'm making music is rarely with these audio tracks, and it's more with MIDI. And MIDI basically just means like the standardized signal types that transfer the information that relates to different notes. So in a way, MIDI is like the way to tell computer that what your notation is. So if you have like a arrangement that you would be able to put on paper with pen, where you decide that, okay, I want that violin plays notes C, F, and B in this order, and the first note is like this length, and the second note is this length, and so on. That's basically what MIDI sort of like does. The MIDI states that these are the notes, this is the order, these are the lengths, these notes play at the same time, they are played with these velocities and so on. So MIDI is like just a standardized signal type that can record this kind of information. And the thing that you have to understand is that MIDI doesn't really state anything about the actual WAV file or the audio. It only sort of like states that these are the notes, but I don't really know how they sound like. This is only the pure information that the notation sort of like contains. And the good thing about this is that if you take a MIDI like track or MIDI information, then you can later decide that which virtual instruments you are going to send that MIDI to. So the same MIDI signal can be used in various contexts. So in modern DAW environment, the main thing is what are the sound libraries that you're actually using with your MIDI information. And this is like a whole industry on its own, because there are many companies these days that only publish and sell sound libraries for music professionals to use in their DAWs. And the whole history for me in my home studio has been the question of what sound libraries I'm going to get, and what sound library upgrades I'm going to do in the next few years. So when I began 10 years ago, the sound libraries that I had back then were really crude in comparison to the sound libraries that I'm currently working with. And hence the sound that I can get out of my Cubase and my studio is closer to professional Hollywood level than it was back in the day 10 years ago. And the main reason is that I have gotten better and better sound libraries. The MIDI itself is the same. I made basically as good MIDI as I do now back in the day, but because my sound library sucked, the MIDI didn't really do much because I couldn't make it sound good. So hence the sound library part is really important if one thinks that okay, I want to do music in my home studio and I know how to compose, why can't I make it sound good? The main thing is that it only sounds good if you have good sound libraries and you know how to use them. And the sound library realm is quite far and wide and open, and there are lots of companies, and they all have their different like approaches and the variety that what kind of sound libraries there is. It's like there are all kinds of sound libraries. They can be really simple, they can be really massive, they can be like traditional orchestral, they can be hybrid, they can be electronic, they can be whatever you can think of. And then there's the marketing side to it, that all the sound library companies are trying to pitch their sound libraries and new libraries and sell them basically. So it's an ever evolving business. And I personally have gravitated towards a few companies that I personally like to use and whose libraries feel intuitive to me. And one of my most used ones is this British company called Spitfire Audio, which have like quite a lot of orchestral and related libraries. And then there's, for example, 8DO that I use quite a lot, especially the choirs. Then there are orchestral tools, which have like quite good orchestral libraries with bit different approach to Spitfire, and so there are like lots of good options to browse through and watch reviews of, and decide that what feel like libraries that you would personally prefer to end up using. And what are the sound libraries? Well, the sound libraries are basically a collection of WAV files. So in the beginning, when I mentioned that if one records traditional band stuff, then you work with audio tracks, which basically include only WAV files. Sound libraries like this only actually, the main beef is that the company has gone to a high quality studio, and in this case, for example, they have gotten the whole BBC Symphony Orchestra with the players and instruments to that studio, and then they have spent like a week or whatever there and just recorded insane amount of WAV files and figured out what's their way of recording them systematically. So for example, if this library tries to wrap the whole symphonic orchestra into a playable instrument, then the main thing is that they have to go through all the symphonic orchestral instruments, violins, cello, basses, woodwinds, brass, percussion, whatever, and record everything as well as possible. So how they go about it is that they make all the violin players play all the possible notes that violin can play in succession, and then they have to play the notes in different velocities, like really soft, really hard, really long, really short, whatever. And they have to do it systematically so that they can actually record everything, so that they have from every note, every variation, and they know how they record the WAV file so that afterwards they can work with them, so that they know that, okay, these WAV files are the violins playing the notes A in this way, and so on. And it's a massive job, because the amount of WAV files that you end up having is like hundreds and hundreds of gigabytes of sound and tens of thousands of files. So it's not a simple thing. That's why they are specialized companies that know how to do it, and it's a massive undertaking every time they sort of want to publish something like this. And eventually, if they manage to do it well, then they have to program the actual library on top of it, which actually sort of understands that how the WAV files are supposed to work together, and then they program the logic that understands that if I send MIDI signal that states that, okay, I want to play notes A, B, and E, then this library understands that, okay, I'm seeing notes A, B, and E in succession, and I'm currently loading basses, so now I know that okay, I have to fetch those notes from my wave library and play them with right velocity and right length and so on. So the magic is actually that the MIDI signal that I'm sending to this library ends up creating actual sound based on the wave files that this company recorded when they went to the studio and had BBC Symphony Orchestra there. So basically, for me, it feels like that I am controlling the actual BBC Symphonic Orchestra, but actually I'm just fetching the sound that's been recorded previously, and this software makes it sound like it's more intuitive than that. And that's all there is to it, basically. So any sound library just does this. It takes MIDI signal, it turns it into sound, and you end up having actual playable like music when you combine the MIDI signal with the sound library of your choice. And as you can see, for example, this library has quite a lot of different articulations that they have done, like legato, longs, long flautando, collegno, whatever. So all of these articulations mean that they had to record these with their live players in the studio, and all of these contain lots of wave files that we can sort of like fetch and use. And so when I'm playing my MIDI keyboard, I'm actually creating MIDI signal that goes to this track, and because I've attached the sound library to this track, then Cubase understands that okay, all the MIDI that is currently being played will be sent to this library, which you can see here that it reacts to my playing and to the notes. And because I've loaded basses with legato articulation, it currently understands that for all these notes that I'm playing, the program has to figure out how does the bass legato wave collection create the output sound. And if I switch the articulation to something else, for example pizzicato, we are essentially loading different wave files from the hard drive or memory, because most of them is loaded to memory so that it's more efficient to use. And the magic that Cubase helps with is that when I have like this MIDI track which has loaded this sound library, then we can configure, for example, expression map, which means that Cubase gives me this collection of the articulations that are available here in the controller row. And when I have recorded some notes, I can then afterwards just decide that okay, the first notes are legato, but before these notes we switch to pizzicato. So now when I play these meaningless notes, I didn't really and they are too high up in the so now these are legato, these are staccato. So this is like what the Cubase and similar DAWs allow one to do. They sort of like give you ways to modify and control your MIDI signals better and more intuitively and more fast, and tell the sound library more easily that what are you trying to sort of like play and create. And for me, that's basically the most simple way to go about it, really. And when I compose, I rarely even use much more than this, so I usually just pick the instrument, then I just record the MIDI notes playing my MIDI keyboard, which is basically just a piano keyboard, and then I have the MIDI notes that I've played. Then I just decide that what the articulations are that I want to use, go through the velocities and see if I accidentally play some of the notes too hard or too low or whatever, and then I move on. So creating music is basically as simple as just recording the right notes, making sure that you are using the right sound libraries and right articulations, and then when you stack together different MIDI tracks with different instruments, for example cellos or violas or whatever, then you finally start to create the tune so that when you play it, all the different MIDI channels are generating their own sound from the sound library instances. For example, here's the violins, and here was the bass, and so on. So you just like combine together different sound libraries to different MIDI signals, and eventually you start to mix together the generated wave files from those tracks. So once again, if we compare it to the traditional way of using just audio tracks and mixing them, like how you mix together bass and drums and guitars, here we are actually taking MIDI tracks but allowing them to generate the actual audio from the sound library instances, and then we mix together the generated audio that the sound libraries are outputting. And then we end up in a much similar way than the traditional band way of doing things, with just the output stereo wave file. That's the mixdown of everything that these sound library instances generated together. So then you have the technical details regarding equalization, like how does the mix work? Do you have too much instruments playing in the same harmonic area, so that you have to notch some instruments away, or you end up like with the technical mixing and mastering kind of process. And I'm not like really competent with those questions. I usually try to just have a balance in my instrumentation in a way so that I don't really have to mix at all. So I try to make sure that my instrumentation is playing together like as well as I can, instead of ending up doing lots of mixing and mastering. So some composers and producers are much more competent with those mixing and mastering related technicalities. So that's something that I personally haven't really learned well to do. But anyways, I think that I have to start quitting soon this stream, but hopefully this sort of like made it somewhat clear that what's the whole thing is all about and how the Cubase and similar DAWs work. So if one figures that how to start like learning how to make music, I actually would prefer or recommend just getting some version of some DAW. For example, the most simple versions of Cubase are quite cheap, I think, like less than $100, I think. They might have like some limitations regarding how many tracks you can have at the same time or how many sound libraries you can load it at the same time, but still the basic idea and the basic workflow is same than with these more professional versions. So it's sort of easy to just jump in and try creating something. And whatever DAW that you sort of like pick up on, it's quite sure that if you go to YouTube and just like search for different variations of Cubase tutorial or how to record MIDI or whatever, it's quite easy to find specific tutorials that show you certain things, that how do you go about doing them. And of course with Cubase and such you get really good manuals that also like give you the basic workflows and examples that how you do basic things with them. So I think that it's mostly about just like jumping into it and then just practice and try different things, and eventually you start to like figuring out the basic workflow from the beginning to the end. How do you start with nothing and end up having some kind of stereo wave file? And but yeah, so if anybody's interested in sort of like just starting creating music in home studio, it's basically as simple as just deciding what DAW to use and then figuring out what might be sort of like reasonable sound library to start with. And it's dependent on the sort of like genre or style that one wants to create. If one wants to create orchestral music or semi-classical contemporary stuff, then it's this kind of symphonic orchestra libraries that are the reasonable options to browse through. But one doesn't need to jump into these like expensive professional ones right away. There are pretty good like more simple and not as robust versions available that are much cheaper and maybe a bit easy to use. So one good forum that I personally browse a lot is it's vicontrol.net, if I remember correctly, and there are like really good sound library reviews and discussion regarding different pros and cons of different libraries. So that's like one forum that I recommend, like just browsing and reading to get the hang of it. So yeah, if you have like any questions you'd like to like have me clarify, just drop a message in this video comments, or just write me and I try to answer. But for many questions I think there are way more competent people out there who are better at answering them, but this is sort of like just a short simple introduction from my personal perspective, so hopefully it gave some clarification regarding how it all works. But yeah, cheers, thanks you for listening, and I see you guys on the next stream.